Good afternoon. Welcome. While I'm giving the introduction, if you have not yet gotten a cupcake or brownie or something and you feel like you would like to have one, please feel free to do it while I'm talking. I will not be upset about it. So please grab a snack. Welcome. My name is Matt Bell. For those of you who haven't met before, I'm a professor of creative writing as well as the director of the ASU Worldbuilding Initiative. It's my pleasure. Thank you. Yes. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Fall 2024 Distinguished Lecture featuring Nick Fuller Googins, author of the novel The Great Transition. I meant to have my copy so I could hold it. I don't have it, but you will see it in a minute. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners at ASU who made today's event possible, including the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Department of English, the Humanities Institute, and the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing. Thanks especially to the staff of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, where the initiative is housed, with a special thanks to Karina Fitzgerald and Eliza Kent, who did so much of the work to make this event happen. I want to also say that this event is part of Humanities Week at ASU, which was the brainchild of our lovely Dean Cohen, who's in the back corner, and a really great celebration across our campus of all things the humanities. And it's really a pleasure to get to do this lecture as part of it every year. So thank you very much to Dean Cohen as well. All right. For those of you joining the ASU Worldbuilding Initiative first time, let me just say briefly, this project emerged out of classes on writing science fiction and fantasy, where students not only study those genres, but also invent worlds of their own. Some of you in the audience are taking that class right now with Em McDonough. Who's here in Em's class right now? Yeah, thank you all for being here. That's right, Em, clap for your students, good. The initiative seeks to take the kind of imaginative, speculative thinking you're doing in that class, work that I think of through Daniel Heath Justice's suggestion to imagine otherwise, and Ursula K. Le Guin's charge for us to become realists of a larger reality, to engage the wider ASU Humanities community, as well as the broad public our university serves. I always want to invite any of you in the audience, either here or online, if you have any ideas for other activities you might take, if you have ways you'd like to be involved, I hope you reach out to me or other people at the initiative at any time. And now for our main event, our fall 2024 Distinguished Lecturer, Nick Fuller Googins, is the author of the novel The Great Transition, out this past year from Atria Books. His short fiction and essays have appeared in the Paris Review, Men's Health, The Sun, the Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. He lives in Maine and works as an elementary school teacher. He is a member of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, as well as the National Education Association, the largest labor union in the United States. I had the good luck of reading The Great Transition before it came out, and I found it to be one of the most hopeful, inspiring novels I've read about the climate crisis. This in large part because Googins has done the difficult, imaginative work of depicting what the transition away from a fossil fuel economy might look like in the lives of real people, allowing readers to imagine not only the challenge of this communal collective effort, but also the rewards that await on the other side. As hopeful as the novel is, it also doesn't shy away from the political, cultural, and emotional hurdles we'll face as we hopefully make this transition, offering up the story of teenager Emmy and her parents as a lens into one possible lived experience of the transition. As I wrote when I first read Nick's book, every worthwhile novel sets out to change its reader. This one sets out to change the world. I hope it does. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nick Fuller Googins.
Right. Thank you all so much for having me here. Is this okay with the microphone? Just like this? Matt, thank you so much. Like Matt was, this was my first book, so everything was brand new for me, including when the publisher said, we need to, can you think of any writers like who you would maybe want to endorse this book? And Matt was so generous with his time and words. So thanks again. And thanks for inviting me here. So I want to read, my goal is to read very small portions of the book and then talk a little bit about how it came about. And especially since a lot of you are in world building, I was trained in writing realistic fiction. And so this, for me, I kind of had to figure this out on the fly of how to build a new world. And it was really fun. And so I want to share a little bit about that. Oh, I didn't realize that was coming from here. Maybe I'll hold it. And then, just a little bit about the writing process and how everything kind of came to be. So I'm going to grab my book here and do a little short reading. Right here. Really quick. About that. All right. So the spark for this novel came about in I teach elementary school right now, so that in the summer times I have a few months to do kind of whatever I want. Now I write a lot. In the past, I'd done different odd jobs. So in the summer of 2018, I was installing solar panels in Belfast, Maine, which is on the coast. And it was really enjoyable work, like really fulfilling. I loved working with a crew of people and working with my hands and working outside. And it's Maine in the summer, which if anyone's been there at that time, it's beautiful. But it just so happened to be at the exact same time that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had won her upset primary. And it was the first time I had ever heard about her. And she started talking about this thing called the Green New Deal. And I'd learned later this was something that the Green Party had come up with, but AOC was the first one kind of bring it nationally. And the Green New Deal being this plan to put millions of Americans to work to save the planet, installing wind turbines and solar. So as I was working on this solar crew, and like my job was basically just bringing solar panels up and down ladders. Like I was definitely the lowest person in the kind of the team there. But I started fantasizing where I was like, whoa, what if somehow this passed and there became a solar corps? Like maybe I could enlist with that, like as like part of an army of solar installers, and maybe work for a few years to try to save the world. And maybe it wouldn't work, but like what a cool thing to do, and what an amazing thing to try, to be like, I was part of this army of workers. And so obviously that, like, the Green New Deal has not happened yet, but I was like 4 years out of my MFA program. I went to Rutgers, Newark. And so, you know, the fiction part of my brain was just already moving with that, where I was like, how could this story come about? And so I knew I wanted to write like a hopeful climate story. I started thinking about it in my mind, like the best worst case scenario of how humanity could come out of this climate crisis. So I was thinking about it for about a year, and this character Larch came out, a young guy living in Maine, set a few decades into the future, and wildfires have destroyed Maine, and he's left on his own. So this first part I'm going to read, I probably wrote like April 2020, so a couple months into the pandemic, and that really influenced how I saw humanity respond in a positive way. So here's Larch. The fires finally burned themselves out, but then we faced a new problem, which was always the case then, and the new problem was the cold. Previous winters had been so mild, but this winter was not. All I had for shelter was the Honda, and the Honda had great battery life as long as I didn't abuse the heater. Striking a balance required loads of blankets and a plastic bottle so I could pee in the car without inviting in the cold. Well, one morning I woke up earlier, around dawn, to an older man knocking on my window. I was parked on the mid-coast, by the Rockland Pier where the police bothered us, and I cracked the window, and cold poured in. And the man asked from behind a million scarves and hats if I needed somewhere to stay. He asked if I had a home. His breath steamed the window. Come on, son, we got a warming center right here in town. People are freezing in their cars. It would be a real shame. Why don't you come in for the cold? Just try it for a night. I asked him about the warming center. I liked how he called me son. I wanted to hear if he might say it again. We'll set you up with a hot meal and a bed, he said. No California king, but it'll beat your bunk here. And of course, there's the arena in Bangor if you want something a little more permanent. So he gave me a flyer and a muffin and wished me luck. And I just have to point out that this was one story I was really excited to share with Emmy for her project. Because many people during the crisis hoarded guns and toilet paper and built fences, true. But many more people did not. Emergencies bring out the best in us. I've seen it over and over. Like that morning I showed up at the warming center and they gave me a paper plate of pancakes and chili for lunch and pasta for dinner and a bed, and everyone was so friendly. The volunteers, the families, so much warmth, just like the man said. 2 days later, I drove to Bangor. The Great Northern Green Arena by the Penobscot River had been converted into a shelter. So I parked, I stamped my boots in line, waiting to register, and there's warm air billowing from the arena entrance, warm air and music and laughter, which is not the sort of thing you realize has been missing until suddenly you do. At the front of the line, a woman asked for ID. I had none, I explained. I'd lost everything in the fire. Well, she asked if anyone could vouch for my age, my identity, or was it just me? I nodded my head. It's just me. I guess she saw something in my face. Oh, baby, come here, she said. We got you now. So that energy, this collective energy of helping each other out, like I saw this right when the pandemic started. I was living in Los Angeles, and the neighborhood was really concerned about Charlene, the most senior resident of Venezia Avenue, making sure Charlene had groceries. And there was a mutual aid association that popped up to get N95 masks to nurses across the city. And there's all this just networks of people helping each other. I went to New Orleans a year after Hurricane Katrina, and I saw the same thing when I worked there doing some deconstruction and reconstruction. I've seen it in Maine when there's a big ice storm. People want to help out. I genuinely, writing this book really made me reflect on, like, I think we are good at heart and just want to help out strangers when given the opportunity. And so that energy really went into the book as I thought about, like, all right, if we were going to overcome the climate crisis in the best way possible, like, what would that kind of grassroots mobilization look like? So what we have is Larch moving to this, the Great Northern Greens Arena, and he enlists with the Forest Corps so that the Department of Emergency Transition has been established. And I was, again, trying to build this world, like, all right, in order for a Green New Deal to really become possible, like, how would this happen? And so I'm imagining this new federal agency and sending out recruiters all around to these different climate refugee centers. And Larch enlists with the Forest Corps. And so he thinks he's going to be replanting forests and fighting wildfires and carbon sinking trees. But all of the companies in New England are all pulled to New York City for a couple big projects. So Maine company is now in New York. This is about a year later. One job, called the Blue Dunes, was a 40-mile necklace of barrier islands from Staten Island to Long Island. The kind of project that seemed impossible. We did it in 2 months. 10 companies dumping sand and pouring concrete around the clock. We were kids, most of Maine company under 20. No one was old enough to remember when big public projects outside of China were built like this. We knew unemployment, food banks, suicide. The idea of forward progress, it was something from ancient American history, when our ancestors built the Empire State Building and the Hoover Dam and the California Bullet Train and the Lunar Gateway Station. But now we were those people. And it wasn't magic. It was just one truckload of riprap after another, one spot weld and then the next, one concrete slab beside a second. Our bodies were the instruments that made it happen. Our hands, you couldn't not feel proud, especially if the job was near a mutual aid zone, families bringing out hand warmers and coffee and enough pizza to make a flood barrier of its own, kids running to tag our bumpers and old folks leaning from windows cheering as our convoys rolled out. People loved comparing the Great Transition to war, glorious combat with an invisible enemy, humanity's last defense, our final counterattack. The comparison felt a little uncomfortable because a lot of transition workers had taken the military transfer offer, they'd seen actual battle, but it did feel true in moments when the neighborhoods came out for us. I remember this one study that got some attention after the transition, and it showed how suicides had dropped in direct relationship to enrollment numbers, especially young people, especially young men. And I believe it. Sometimes heading back after pouring concrete all night by floodlight, the sky glowing red with dawn, the ferry captain would pull the horn for no good reason, and we'd all raise a fist and launch into "This Land Is Your Land" or some other song. And it was cheesy, but it shot tears to my eyes, partly from exhaustion and partly from living through the end of the world together as a family and doing something about it, trying. So this part of the world building was really fun, where I was trying to imagine, all right, if the Department of Emergency Transition created the Solar Corps and the Forest Corps and all these different branches and put millions of people to work, what would that work actually look like? And one thing that was interesting in a hopeful way in real life was that so much of what ended up in the book are actually real things that exist in the world now, either technology that's in development or has been developed, or plans that people have actually really thought through. So this idea of like the Blue Dunes is a plan that Greater New York Harbor has for possibly trying to stop some of the hurricane surges that are gonna come in. Other stuff was like, oh, like here's an example I thought that I found, I didn't know anything about this. It's called a gravity storage warehouse. So there's this problem with solar energy, like how are we gonna produce power during nighttime or when it's stormy out? So people have come up with so many innovative ways to do this. And in China, this is actually already happening. It's like, imagine a massive, like Costco, but maybe like 4 levels high. And in next to it is a huge solar field. And the solar energy is being used to raise these giant slabs of composite stone to the ceiling. And then when it's needed, when the power is needed, it'll start releasing it and coming down really, really slowly to create some more power. So there's all these little technological things that are happening around the world. And in a kind of interesting side way, it made me think like about the climate crisis itself. You know, like sometimes I'm imagining like, what if we had to invent brand new technologies to get out of this, to save ourselves? And that would be one scary thing. But we have all the technology we need. We have all the money we need. And, you know, even today, like looking around, it's so beautiful and sunny here. And I was thinking like, it seems kind of, it's crazy that like every rooftop isn't covered in solar panels. And how that on one hand, we feel like, oh, well, that's, I don't know, like we just don't do that. So it seems impossible. But one thing that I guess like one idea or one feeling that came out of researching and writing this book was like, what is possible and what has been done in the past? And as I was thinking about it, like just looking out the window today, it's like probably to put solar on all the buildings in Phoenix, really, like if the Army Corps of Engineers decided that this was going to be a priority and we're going to fund it to the same extent that we're going to fund the Pentagon, a year, like maybe half a year, could maybe even less time, it could be completely done. And so I love to look back at history too, for thinking about decades in the future. So one huge source of inspiration for this was the actual New Deal that happened in the 30s. And I couldn't believe, like I had to make sure and like look at these statistics many times to make sure what I was reading was true, because it seemed unbelievable. So I'll just rattle off like three in succession. Is that FDR in the early 30s created the Civilian Conservation Corps by executive order. And so this was going to be a program to put millions of Americans to work building trails. And like if you go hiking, especially, oh no, I guess all over the country, you'll still see like huts that was built by the CCC. So within 3 days after signing this executive order, they had already recruited their first people for the job. Within 2 weeks, they had already built their first camp in George Washington National Forest. And within 3 months, they had hundreds of thousands of people working at thousands of camps around the country. And so like to think of the scale of that happening at a time before GPS and before interstate highways and before the internet, and I was like, oh my God, like if we could do that in the 30s, like surely that could be done now. And so sometimes like the science fiction parts of this book that seemed almost like the hardest to believe, you know, there's stuff in here about quantum computing, and I think we'll be like, yeah, we think that's coming down the pipeline. Artificial intelligence, obviously. But in some ways, the hardest world building for me to accept that this could be possible and that readers could buy into this was like the social political stuff. And so that was a huge, I think that gave me like license to believe in something bigger, to see like this has been done before at a time when we didn't have half of the technology and resources that we have now. So that was really, really inspiring, kind of in an unexpected way, to go back in time and researching what has happened to create this world in the future. So one thing I really wanted to do here was to show like how humanity could get to this place. And in my mind, I was thinking about this like a utopia. Like I wanted to write a utopia, but I had not read many utopias, because like many of us who grew up in the US or Canada or the UK, we have read a lot of dystopias in our lives. And the list, when we really start thinking about it, it's like, I tried to like think about it chronologically from middle school on. And for me, it was like Lord of the Flies, The Giver, and then high school was, let's see, 1984, or maybe Animal Farm first, 1984, Brave New World. And all these books teach the same lesson, which is that if you go out and try to fix the world, you're going to make it worse than it was before, and be left like alone. And which is a horrible message when you are at any age, but especially as a teenager. So I was like, I want to write this utopia, but I don't know, I don't have any examples. But then I remembered there was this amazing example, which is Ursula K. Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed. It's, it's like, so that book is so important to me because it became like a blueprint for this book. And so I went back and I reread it, and I like mapped out every chapter and what she had done with the timelines and everything. But the big lesson I took away from it was simply she created the utopia and then put it under threat. Because in my mind, I was like, how, if this is a utopia, like I know I need conflict in my story, in my novel, where's the conflict going to be if everything is great? And then that book showed me, oh, the conflict is the utopia is under threat, and that the main characters have to save it, or they might want to save it, or they might want to change it in some way. And so that unlocked so much for me for the second part of the book, which is set much further into the future, where Larch has a 15-year-old daughter, Emmy. She is growing up in this utopian city of Nuuk, Greenland. And I wanted to depict the best worst case scenario following the collapse of like the ecological collapse, which is, there's a lot of like carbon emissions that are baked into the atmosphere. So even if today we were to stop emitting, the changes that are baked in, like some bad shit is going to happen no matter what. So I'm trying to think, what would be the best worst case scenario? And so I wanted to create a world, like a city that I would want to live in, where I could walk everywhere. When we lived in Los Angeles, there was a community compost, little compost hub where you could bring your compost and dump it off there. So I was just like trying to like cherry pick all the best things that I had seen in life and try to put it into one city. But I still was like, I just don't know. For me, this is a huge leap to try to create like the world is going to look way different because the sea levels are going to rise. Like we just know that's going to happen. Places near the equator are going to become close to uninhabitable. There's going to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees, extinctions. Like these things are going to happen, and it sucks. But I need to depict that world, and then also this like utopian city or utopian federation of cities. And I just did like, I thought about it like for months, and then and I found this has happened twice to me when working on a big project, and I bet it's happened to a lot of other writers in the room. You're just, you know what it's like? It's like when you learn a new word and then you start hearing it all the time. And so I was like, the universe just sends you what you need. So I was at my brother's place in New York, and he went to school for urban planning, and he had this newsletter on his desk from his urban planning school, and at the back of it was a book review called Dystopia Utopia 2100. And it was about urban planners and architects who had created these renderings of different cities, and they were calling it their best worst case scenario. And I was like, oh my God, I just needed to see visually like how someone else maybe thought about this. And so that was something else that I had never considered as for the research in this, where these futurists, or, you can picture these like computer generated architectural modelings of a building that hasn't been made yet, but that's what they're envisioning it as. And it was so helpful for me. And I didn't end up, copying it, but it just like gave me license to imagine this new city. And Nuuk was a city that these urban planners had looked at by saying Greenland is very far north of the poles. It's going to be cooler there. It's also perched on the cliffs well above the ocean for sea level rise. And then I was able to like cherry pick all these different technologies and looking at some of the renderings to try to create this utopian city. And on top of that, though, I was like, I want, if this is a city I want to live in, like there's no corporations, everything's owned by workers. And so I was trying to imagine like a cooperative system. And in Spain, there's this amazing system of cooperatives called Mondragon, which, if anyone's read any Kim Stanley Robinson novels, he usually will mention it indirectly some way. And it's this really inspiring thing that actually exists now again. And so I used a lot of that to try to think about like, how would this new city be run? So I want to give you a little peek of that city. And this is going to be from Emmy's perspective. So this is Emmy. She's 15 years old. And she has been born after the crisis. So all she knows is like this utopia. She's only heard about how bad things used to be from her parents, but this is the world she's now grown up in. Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned she's been asked to write a report for her school about the Great Transition. And so as a teacher, I have corrected so many papers over my lifetime and given a lot of feedback. And so I got to kind of weave that into the book. So Emmy's drafts of her Great Transition project are in here, which, sorry, just from a craft point of view, I just want to point out, anyone who's creating a new world, you realize like we're walking this really fine balance between dumping too much information on the reader and risking them tuning out. But then on the other end, making it too confusing so that they don't know what world they're in. And it's such a fine balance, right? And so I wasn't sure how to go about this, but then realized, oh, if Emmy is working on this project, this is going to be a cool way to show to just summarize what this world looks like, but from the voice of this character. So this is Emmy Vargas Brinkman, North American History, Mrs. Helmandi, Great Transition Project, first draft, introduction. Imagine your home is on fire, but instead of getting the fire department, you just watch the flames and live life like everything is fine. That was the climate crisis. It's hard for people now to imagine, but during the crisis, everyone knew it was happening and did basically nothing to stop the criminals causing it. When my parents were my age, to take one example, the destroying classes were still extracting oil and producing gas-powered cars and airplanes while getting richer and richer. And some people, like Mama Greta, she tried to stop them, but she failed. And then the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed and the Great Transition started. The Great Transition led to everything good that people take for granted now, including the Southwest Solar Authority, the Half-Earth Accords, the San Francisco Bay Gate, the Big U, the Great Green Wall, plus carbon and methane capture in new cities like Nuuk, as well as recycled old cities like Miami, where life was impossible because of heat waves and flooding and mosquito diseases like West Nile and dengue, which we thankfully have vaccines for now. And our teacher has a comment on the side of the page. This is a long sentence. Fantastic supporting details, but try to avoid run-ons. All of these combined efforts helped us get to day zero. Day zero was the day when the world reached net zero emissions. This year's the 16th anniversary, and most people treat it as a major holiday, but not everyone. Some people, my mom, for example, says celebrating day zero would be like my basketball team celebrating a win after losing 1,000 games in a row while destroying our own court and all getting injured. Other people, my dad, for example, say that's exactly when a win is needed most. In conclusion, the Great Transition was essential for our survival, but should have started decades or even a century earlier. Then kids now would be able to see animals like koalas and giraffes and elephants. And to add on, we would have white sandy beaches and coral reefs with neon fish. And lastly, billions of people wouldn't have been forced to flee their homes or die. For example, my grandparents, who never got to hear about the Great Transition or celebrate day zero or meet me. So that Emmy's project weaves through the book and keeps giving us like a little more information at a time. And that again was a way, kind of like structural way I found to try to sidestep that problem of overloading the reader with too much info. And then it was also really fun to imagine a futuristic utopian city and to just think about that, you know, like we as a species are so multifaceted, and in any place, there are going to be people who experience the same thing radically differently. And so, of course, in a utopia, there will be like moody teenagers who are like, I hate this place and it sucks. And so this is the first 2 pages of the book. And so if you've read it, this will just be a little echo. And if you haven't read it, I'll save you the time for the first 2 pages. So this is Emmy opening everything up. There was this big throwback craze at school that started on Cooperative Day with a band called U2. And Cooperative Day is when all the major cooperatives make presentations in the auditorium to convince you to apply. PepsiCo is there, and the Alibaba Cooperative, and CareCorps, juniors and seniors, and Uniqlo, and Public Safety, and DisneyCo, and Meme Feed, and tons more. The day isn't so awful, except it's on a Sunday and it's mandatory. It got me out of garden hours with my mom, but still, who wants to be at school on a weekend? But then, Maddie Choi, somehow she got on the network during the very first presentation. The Carbon Capture Cooperative was on stage, and she cast a song, Sunday Bloody Sunday, through the whole auditorium. It was hilarious. Maddie Choi was a hero for the prank and for introducing us all to U2. And I remember sitting in the auditorium laughing and then suddenly quiet with everyone as we were like, how come we have never heard anything this good before? Overnight, everyone became U2 obsessed. Lunch was a battle zone. You ate on this side of the cafeteria because the Joshua Tree was the greatest album ever recorded, or you ate over there because Unforgettable Fire was the best. My basketball team warmed up to a beautiful day. The only oldies I knew before then were Dolly Parton and Taylor Swift and Valerie June, because my dad said his mom used to listen to them. But now I became obsessed along with everyone else. The difference, however, was that to everyone else, the oldies were a fad that ended like all fads end. For me, though, the fad just keeps going and going and going. I can pick almost any year before the crisis and name the top hits all around the world. I have them memorized. I love the oldies. Music recorded pre-crisis, it just sounds different. It's better, more real. There were still huge problems back then, obviously. Like the band U2 was from Ireland, which had been colonized by England for basically 500 years. And there's poverty and pandemics, and like 1,000 people owned everything on the planet. But no one had any idea what was coming. Not really. It's hard to imagine what it must have felt like. I try. I pretend it's 1980 or 2010 or 1960. We think everything is great and will continue being great forever. Not even thinking it, just assuming it. Maybe that's why their music was so good and why I love it so much. I can slip on my headphones and turn out Madonna or Beyonce or Prince and pretend that nothing bad is ever gonna happen again. So let's give just a little taste of what this utopian futuristic city of Nuke looks like. And again, it was really fun, like coming up with all of the physically and the technology and what this would look like. But another thing I just wanted to discuss kind of on like a writing craft level was I went really like back and forth a lot, you know, researched so much into quantum computing and also like what would different types of government look like. And again, it was that balance between like, I could write so much about what the technology might look like at this time. I could write so much about how of this world that I'm imagining and had like kind of mapped out and separately of this like federation of different sister cities cooperating together. And that might be super boring for a reader who's like wants to follow just the plot line of Emmy and Larch and her mom. And so I just felt like one thing that really helped me was thinking about like how I walk around in life, thinking about like if I have my phone out and I'm not thinking about like the satellite networks and how this is possibly working, as if I could even explain that to begin with. And I'm also not thinking about like, wow, like the Fed raised interest rates and so monetary policy and like I don't also there's so many things that that really have so much control over our life and influence our life in so many ways that we don't really think about. And so by putting these characters, by writing them in the first person, especially like a really, really tight first person, I felt like it allowed me to not have to get into that in super detail. And so I'd researched a ton about it and thought about it, and then I could really carefully decide like, I'm just going to mention this technology and I have faith that the reader will be able to kind of fill in the pieces. I will just kind of like mention how the sister city system works and have readers will be like, oh, well, like we have jury duty. I get an idea of like some kind of public service that we have to do. And so I felt like that freed me up a lot too, and definitely cut down from like first drafts being, you know, many hundreds of pages longer than what actually came out. And it felt really good after that to just be cutting and cutting and cutting. And just the last thing I wanted to mention before we have a little discussion and love to just have a conversation and any questions about the book or writing. And it's just that like thinking about the social part of science fiction or speculative fiction, it wasn't something that I had like consciously set out to do. But like how I mentioned, looking at what had happened during the New Deal had a huge influence on the book. Thinking about like what it meant to be part of a group really influenced not just this book, but I kind of like thoughts that I had swimming around my head that I hadn't really been able to articulate before. And it made me like, as I was thinking back in life, like some of the times where I felt like most alive in this way that I don't know if there's an exact English word for it. We're always in groups of people trying to do something together, whether it was like youth sports or also anyone who's been to a protest, or if you've ever walked on a picket line, but also if you've ever been part of a choreographed dance or just singing together with a big group of people, that these are really like enlivening moments. And so I really wanted to capture that in the book, that this is like such a part of the human experience that in a novel is sometimes hard to do because because of the novel usually follows one or two people around. But we live collectively, and like all of us, if we think about it, we'll think about all the groups that we're part of and how much meaning that gives us. And so it just made me reflect on my own writing and like looking to next projects. Like I want to show a really full picture of my character, including them in groups. And like, what are we doing together as a group? And then just the last thing, and this goes back to Ursula K. Le Guin, who's such an inspiration for this. And again, kind of like unlocked this mental block I had, or I was like, I don't know what to do next. And she has this famous quote, which I think I had heard from her before I'd even read any of her books, about when she'd gotten a legacy award at the for the National Book Awards. And she said something along the lines of, the power of capitalism seems inescapable, but so too did the divine right of kings. And thinking back in time, from every horrible, dark place that we've been in as a species, from feudalism to slavery to monarchy, there must have been so many people who were like, this is the way things are, and it's the way they're always going to be. It's been like this for hundreds of years, and you are like foolish for even thinking you could change anything, naive, like grow up, get real, get serious. And then things change, and they always change, and they can change so fast. And so I think that also gives me hope for real life, and then also for our writing, thinking about the future and different systems. I hope that it like allows all of us writers just to kind of like give more license to this like collective movement of change, and just that it is possible for things to change and get better, because they always have. And I'll just end it there. So thanks so much for listening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate that. And did you guys read Left Hand of Darkness and Worldbuilding time? Yeah. So everybody else is also reading Le Guin. So we have a room full of Le Guin people, which is really great. I didn't know that was a part of your sort of inspiration here too, but Le Guin was really important to me writing my own last novel. It's also partly about climate change and collective action stuff. And it's kind of interesting to feel that like long sort of effect of those books on us and different things. So yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'm glad everybody in the room has had some of that experience as well. So it's nice to get to share that with all of you. I'm just gonna ask like one or two questions, and I really want to open it up to you all. So I think one of the things I really appreciate about your presentation and about your book in general is this sort of utopian sort of focus. I know for myself, I always think like I have like a utopian heart and like a dystopian plot brain, right? You know, like I'm like, oh, things should be better, and then I write like another terrible place, right? And I really appreciated that about you. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the emotional experience of writing a novel about the climate crisis. Because I think, I imagine you did a lot of research, or obviously heard about some of it, on top of the sort of imaginative effort it takes to depict some of the scenes in the book that are about environmental devastation, and there's a human cost of some of those things. I was really struck in the rereading of the book about how much of it is also about like refugee crisis at the border and things like that, you know, that these kind of really difficult things to write about. And I wondered if there were times where you found like sort of entering that research into that material sort of daunting or dismaying, and maybe like how that changed, how writing the book has sort of changed your own approach to living through the climate crisis.
I think so I grew up in the woods of Massachusetts, and always been kind of you know, climate or environmentally conscious. Like when we were growing up, remember acid rain, the ozone layer? Yeah. Like these were things that were like I remember like almost in tears about like the rainforest, and it was always been on my mind. And then I did a few like worked at Sierra Club for a little bit, Greenpeace, like some kind of environmental leaning things. So I think I knew the bad stuff. I knew what was coming is going to be pretty bad. But then as I got into the climate crisis research, I'd say like the thing that really, I'd say like anger was the emotion that mostly came up, because once I started researching this, like I knew a lot of the science, but it was like the people that are causing this, like the climate criminals. And this was, you know, I could have gone down this research hole for so long. And I'll try to give like the really quick pitch, but it's the carbon 100. So there's 100 companies and state-owned institutions that have caused about 80% of all emissions. And so when I think about like, okay, I think about like a corporation, it seems so amorphous. But then like, well, there's a C-suite of executives running that corporation, and maybe a board. And so if we think about 100 corporations, and maybe the advertising agencies and their banks that fund them, and the lobbyists, and give them each like 20 people that are running the show, this is like
tens of thousands of people. It's not that many that are like driving us off a cliff they're destroying the world. And that anger, oh, because sorry, I should also mention, like they have known exactly what they're doing. Like there's all these court documents that have come out that like Exxon scientists in the 70s predicted exactly what was going to happen if they kept extracting oil, but they still know now. And like there's more fossil fuel infrastructure going on now than any time before. And so, and to think about like that anger went a lot into, it appears a lot in the book. There's a lot of characters that are very upset that the people who caused this are still alive and getting away, have kind of got away with it. And so it made me think a lot about like vengeance, justice, I was like looked into a lot about like South Africa, into apartheid, and to be like, oh, you know, we're like, oh, apartheid ended. That's great. And it is, obviously, but there's still there, like a lot of people would be like, justice wasn't actually served because economically, like the Black population did not get ownership over the land. And so a lot of this injustice kept like fermenting down the line. So I guess I would say that the research overall pissed me off, like it made me angry. And so I guess, but then on the flip side of it, like I can't be angry all the time. I don't want to be angry all the time. And so the hopeful part of it was that, again, like we have all the technology, we have all the money to do this. Like it could be done so quickly to end emissions and start turning things around. And it's like just political. And sometimes that can feel like that's never going to happen. We're stuck in this two-party system forever. Like we're doomed. But then I really try to take solace in like, yeah. So let me just back up. There's this amazing scholar, Kristen Gotzi, who wrote this great book, Everyday Utopias, a nonfiction book exploring utopias over the past 2,000 years. I get to have a conversation with her. Such a great, inspiring read. And she mentions researching East Germany in the 80s and meeting people who had family members that had killed themselves because they were like, I'm never gonna be free. Communism's never gonna end. I'm never gonna see Paris. And then like the next week, the Berlin Wall fell down. And like, we just never know. Things can change so quickly. So that part of me, that hope tries to balance off some of the anger.
No, I have such a loud voice already. This is terrifying. I think I felt really similar things doing similar kinds of research where I remember like some of the climate science being like, I stopped being able to read it for a while. Like I just like a new IPCC report coming up. So I was just like, I can't even look at it, you know, I was just too sort of enmeshed. But I took a lot of hope out of like, of some of these examples you're talking about, and then also like feeling like the solutions were actually pretty known. Like what we could be doing is like actually pretty generally agreed upon by scientists. It's more like a political will question or a question of like power and a question of communal action. I think that's one of the things I really appreciate the books. It's people doing things together, which is the hardest thing to sort of imagine. I remember at the beginning of COVID, we like immediately had a universal basic income for a while. Like here's $2,000 for everybody, and then immediately it was like, oh, we can never do that again. Yeah. You know, and I was like, we did that so easily. It sort of was always sort of available to us. I think I want to open it up to questions just for time, because I know so many of you read the book and certainly have questions about it or about writing fiction in general. Please, yeah, start us off, just nice and loud for us.
When I was reading the book and kind of hearing you talk about it, it seems like you sort of built the world and then decided what story you wanted to like tell within it. And I was just curious what about Larch and Emmy is the most important parts of them that make them the most important people for the story you wanted to tell.
Thanks. That's a great question. And so that's so, you know, if I really think back like how the world was built, it was, I would actually like have, I remember this scene where I was like, all right, Emmy and her mom are, like Emmy needs to go to school. So I'm like, okay, they're walking to school, like, what is that gonna look like? And then like, oh, they could be taking the compost on the way to school because there could be like a community compost. So I feel like the world was built like as the characters are starting to move through it. And then everything would kind of just knit together. So it was like, oh, they're in this plaza and oh, construction workers could be putting up a banner for a celebration. And then it'd be like, oh, maybe the celebration, it could be like an anniversary celebration. And so I think that's how the world was mostly built, was kind of moving the characters around. Where I was like, okay, I know I want like some element of they're gonna need to like escape at the last second, and Larch needs to save Emily. Like, there's a stampede. Oh, it does make sense that there's a seawall because of like with the sea level rise, so that will be there too. So anyway, I think that was how the world came about. But as far as the most important parts of Christina and Larch, I think are the two like voices that I hear a lot in my head, which are like one voice is like, we are living in a climate crisis. We need to do everything we can at every second to stop it. And this is more Christina, Emmy's mom, who's like this could happen again, and the people that caused this are still out there, and that's not okay. And then Larch, who's like, we have done a lot, and we need to enjoy life also, and we need to like be with family, and our daughter is really, we need to make sure she has a nice life. And so those sort of became like the two kind of like warring voices, which is just something that I personally experience a lot. And also it's with the climate crisis. And then I experienced this a lot with gun safety teaching, where I'm worried about school shootings all the time and want to do everything I can, like with my union for gun control. And then at the same time, I'm like, I can't think about this all the time. I have to go on a walk and enjoy life at the same time. So yeah, those became kind of the two poles of the book. Thanks. Anything else? Yes.
Why did you choose not to set the book in a specific year, or at least not list it in the pages?
A specific year?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I have a secret timeline. So okay, one fascinating thing. This was so fun. Like again, every part of the publishing process for me was like, I can't believe, like, I never imagined this would happen. Like, this is such a dream, and this is so fun and interesting. And one of them was being copy edited, which I always thought was like, you know, it is a lot of periods and commas and stuff like that, but it's also like making sure everything, the timeline totally makes sense. So it'd be like, well, it says here that Emmy and Larch took the hyperlink to this station at nighttime, but according to this chapter, it should be morning. So I started making timeline of the days, and then it turned out I didn't need to make a timeline of the years too. And then I was like, all right, I'm just gonna put this in the certain whatever decades it is. The reason I didn't name it for me was like completely because of technology. I just thought people, you know, there's so many people who are like talk about the singularity or futurists who will say exactly by this year we will have this and this and this, and I just didn't want that to be part of the conversation. You know, like, oh, that's unrealistic, we won't have that at this time, or that's really the worry in my head was people would be like, oh, by this time technology would be so much more advanced than this. And the other thing, just speaking about technology, that's really made me wonder is if humanity truly poured all the resources we need into solving the climate crisis that are required, it did make me wonder like how that would affect technological development for things like AI, which now are like is sucking up like so much power to run server farms to create like funny images on Twitter. And so I don't know, that's just kind of, I was wondering about that. Long answer, technology. Short answer, technology. Anything else? Yeah.
So Larch is sort of the seaweed guy. His parents, you know, do the farming and remedies, and he makes lots of seaweed dishes throughout the whole book. I was wondering what sort of research you did about seaweed, or if you have like a personal relationship with cooking with seaweed or farming seaweed.
I do, yes. So I have the other thing that is like we'll see so many first novels are very autobiographical. And so this one set decades in the future. My wife and I don't have kids. I don't live in a utopian city. Like a lot of it can't be autobiographical, but still writing a speculative book, so much can be. And so I had living in Maine, we have a lot of seaweed, and we had met a man named Larch, who is 75 now and lives in northern Maine, and he still goes out and harvests wild seaweed in his wetsuit every April. And then I got to stay with him for a week to work with him. And it was one of these times, like similar to installing solar, where I'm just like, oh, this would be a fun experience, and I don't know what'll come out of it. And sure enough, like now I know like the ins and outs of a DIY seaweed business. And then we would buy seaweed and cook with it. Like it's great iodine. If anyone needs some iodine, put some seaweed in the soup. That was it. Oh, and I briefly considered, there've been these headlines. kelp is gonna be the new gold, or like the new gold rush. And so a good friend of mine, we went out and did this one weekend course, and so it was like very picturesque. We went out on boats into a harbor in Maine, and there's kelp farms, and it was it was a sunny day, and it started snowing. And we're pulling up these huge strands of kelp, and it looked like what a magical, this would be so fun to do. And then we learned like the economics of it are like compared, kelp farming makes land farming look like, oh, that's like a millionaire's. It's like you can make tons of money land farming. So anyway, the dream ended then, but I did have like a brief flirtation with being a seaweed guy myself. Anything else? Yeah, at least.
I'm kind of curious with Emmy, you mentioned in your speech, okay, there's something comes into your life and it kind of sticks in there. For me, that was Emmy's eating disorder that kind of comes up, my partner struggled with it, and it was always in my mind, it was always circling around. And I'm really curious, what was that inspiration for that internal conflict while she's navigating through this entire political, physical conflict?
Sure. That's a great question, because that was probably the thing I was most concerned about in this book, was writing a 15-year-old girl and going into it with such trepidation and being so careful. And one thing that happened during this publishing process, which I'll just back up to mention that like this was the most circuitous route ever for this book. Maybe not ever. I think there's a lot of circuitous routes, but this was, for this book to be published, it was not querying an agent. Agent submits, book is published. It was a very roundabout way, which, long story short, I had pitched another novel that failed, did not get sold, but one editor was like, hey, if Nick has anything else, send it my way. And then all I sent was this idea of, I had a climate crisis utopia where the climate criminals are being hunted down. And he said, okay, that's cool, send me 50 pages. But then his imprint folded. But then, this is the part I wanted to mention. He is like, I know an editor at Penguin Random House who was really interested in hopeful climate fiction. And I just thought that was like, there's some appetite out there for hopeful stories. So this woman at Hogarth worked with me to get edited 150 pages. And it was just Larch. The whole book was just Larch's perspective. And then had passed it around to the editorial office, and they were like, we really like Emmy. Like, can you rewrite the book? Half the book. And as soon as I started, it was like that. I don't know, getting edits, you probably felt this too, Matt. Like when you start on them, first it might be like, oh my God, this is a huge job.
Yeah.
But then if it feels good, and you're like, ah, oh, such good advice. Such good advice. So once I went down that route, the biggest inspirations for her, I'd say it was from three sources. One, a good friend of mine's daughter who had a kind of ambiguous disordered eating manifestation from some deep anxiety that wasn't obvious. Living like in the suburbs of Boston, you'd think like pretty comfortable life, and she's fine now, but that was a scary moment. So a lot of direct inspiration from that. But then also I used to tutor in the Pacific Palisades of Los Angeles, which is probably one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the whole country. And a couple of kids I worked with had dropped out of school because they were so anxious. And you'd think like, what do these kids possibly have to be worried about? Like they live in a utopian community. But it's just as a good reminder that like anxiety hits all of us and we don't know what's going on. And so that went a lot into Emmy. And then also I worked briefly in Maine's juvenile state prison as a tutor. And those kids had like every reason to be horribly anxious and depressed as any human being would living in a situation like that. But at the same time, we're like, joking around and dreaming about their futures. And just, it was such a reminder of like all the conflicting emotions we all have in us all the times, but especially at that age. And so I'd say those three parts, all three of those parts together kind of coalesced into Emmy.
I have a question or two more if someone has them. You just want to read it.
Okay, I guess I might as well just
Yeah.
continue the Emmy conversation.
Yeah.
So I guess the only thing that stood out as you literally read the first 2 pages was Emmy's love of the quote unquote bullies.
Yeah.
So which was kind of like threw me off guard of how like everyone getting hyped up over YouTube. I know, maybe it's because I'm not a YouTube fan, but so I just want to kind of know from like a character development standpoint of what kind of inspired like her love of the oldies and how like you decide like this is gonna be a recurring like defining character trait that kind of perspective like and develop like throughout the novel. So how did you come up with that?
I think that, so again, I'd say some of the. This goes back a little bit to when I worked in the prison. That these kids who are like 13 to 18 years old. And like imagine, like especially like 13, 14, 15 years old, and they didn't have access to music. Like so many humiliations and abuses in that institution. But to imagine at that age and you can't play whatever song you want to. They might maybe once a day could have access to like a computer and listen to a song. But that would be it. And just thinking at that time in our lives when we are feeling independent and our own agency, but yet still under a lot of control from our parents and teachers and don't have a driver, maybe can't drive. Music was like the way that we could really express ourselves. And so to see kids without that kind of was a reminder of how important music is in a time when you feel maybe like isolated and lonely and anxious. So I really wanted to use that. And then the other thing I kept trying to remind myself and thinking about was like, all right, I'm writing this utopian, in this utopia, and I'm thinking a lot about like the politics and economics and technology, but like in any society, there's always like mostly people like we want to have fun in life and enjoy life. And so there's gonna be music and entertainment, and also Larch works for a professional sports team. And I wanted to, like there will be sports in Utopia too. Like I'm not a huge sports person myself, but like that's a part of human culture. And so I wanted to make sure to like really to make this world seem as realistic as possible, to include all the other parts of our cultures besides the like serious, like social and economic and political stuff. Oh, and then just the last thing I'll mention is it was a fun practice to try to think of a song that you've heard a million times where you're like, my ears are gonna bleed if I hear this again. But try to imagine it for the very first time you've ever heard it. And that's what I'd be like I am sick of you two. Like I don't love it either, but I try to be like, all right, I'm listening to this as if I've never heard it before. Be like,
That big emotional.
yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yes.
But I did want to ask what led you to choose the technologies you did and which ones that you chose to leave out for this stuff? Because so far in my read through, I have not seen mention of like molten salt or thorium reactors, and I wanted to ask if those were considered for the book or why they might have been left out.
Yeah, that's a great question. I had done like so much research into the different like climate technologies, and so as I'm writing, like I don't know, I'm just personally like especially like in revision, I'm really trying to envision the reader and the reader's experience and taking care of the reader and making it interesting. And like I love personally reading fiction and also learning new things. And I'll often assume, which if I'm reading whether historical fiction or speculative, that like a lot of this research is true. I don't know if that's like always a good assumption, but I'm like, I think the author did this, researched this, but I don't want to pull the reader out of it by making something like too technologically obscure. And I was thinking a lot about like Larch's, like Emmy is a 15-year-old, and Larch's job is he's a nutritionist for a professional basketball team. And so these are not people like let me put it this way: if Larch was a scientist or worked for like the carbon capture cooperative, then we probably would hear way more about the science. And so like in my mind, I was like, that's not exactly going to be, that's not the point of the book that I'm hoping to write. Is more about like the social and family dynamics. And then a way to not bog the book down too much of those details is by keeping it through like these characters' day-to-day lives. If that answers your question a little bit. Yeah. And then I just felt like just by mentioning, like, I mean, I've heard other writers like joke about this, be like, oh yeah, you just like throw in quantum computing.
Yeah.
And then that's like, oh yeah, futuristic stuff. Like we don't have to fill in the blanks yet. So I just do that a couple times too. Just to try to give like some signifiers that like technology has progressed, but we're not going to get into the weeds here.
I just really wanted to ask about the craft like slash style book, not using any quotation marks in the book. I was just curious as to Cause I personally, I've never read a book that didn't have quotations in it before, and I thought that it was really interesting and like it worked better for me than I expected it to, so I was just wondering like where you were coming from with that choice.
I gone back and forth a lot on the quotation marks, but what happened was like, once I had this idea of like, all right, this is a book I want to write, and I thought about it for a long time, and then I just like, you know, I'm sure all of us have different ways of like getting into our stories and books, but I started kind of like writing from Larch's voice, like trying to capture the voice, writing him in scenes. And then when I took out the quotation marks, it just felt different in a way. The closest comparison I could have is like, if I'm watching actors on a stage in a play, and they're reading their cue cards, it's a reminder to me like, oh, I'm watching a play. These are people acting. But when actors are really, really into it, and you can forget for a moment that you're watching the play, it's like it becomes so real. And so some books I had read without quotation marks, I felt like I had started to slip into that, to be like, okay, without the device of those quotation marks there, it's just like a little more seamless. And so then when I tried it without it, it just felt, I was like, I don't know how to explain it, it just feels like a little more large. And then once I did that for him, did it for the rest of the book. Yeah, but thanks.
We're at the end of our time, so I'm gonna ask you one more question. But before I do that, I just want to say there are snacks in the back, so please feel free to get something afterwards. There are also books for sale out in the lobby if you don't have one. And I believe Nick would also be glad to sign books for you if you brought yours. Class would like that signed. I was thinking a little bit about The Dispossessed, and one of my favorite things that Gwyn talked about one time in an interview was that, you know, the world building details you can't get in the book. There's something that you invented that you loved, and you just can't get it in. And Le Guin had invented these communal pickle barrels. If she thought in her utopia, people would always be pickling things, because you just, you know, fermented foods are good, and they would have extras, and they would put them in these communal barrels so that anyone who did not have pickles could get them. And she talks about this in like several interviews, where people would be like, what's the thing you invented, this great science fiction writer, that you can get a book? And she's like, oh, my pickle barrels. And she like, and I was just like, what is your pickle barrel? What didn't get in the book?
What didn't get into the book was like how I was, I mean, it's not nearly as cute as picking barrels. Yeah, it's so
hard to beat the
adorable. Yeah. It was like when I was like envisioning like how politically, like how this would work through the world. And so we have this like, Nuke is the city in Greenland, and people go to New York City to do extraction work in their sister city. And then we get the idea that there's cities like this all over the world. And so I had like done a lot of research and looking into like how a federation system might work, like essentially a post-capitalist world. And to me, like that's so exciting, but not maybe not as a reader.
Yeah.
So I would like, there's definitely earlier drafts where I've tried to like, you know, have characters talking about this, and it just felt like I was like, I guess that one's just for me to keep in the pickle barrel. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.